Apparently Modo is dying, which I think is sad, but it did start me thinking on some features that Modo has that even Blender still doesn't have with its very active development. So let's look at these holes, for example. So this is something that I modeled in Blender, and you can see how these holes get smaller and smaller as you move towards the edges. Now, if you want to take a guess on how I did that, if you answered Falloffs, you'd actually be wrong. This is how I did it. So I selected this, I did something like this, and then I simply started scaling each row manually, like that. Deselect, repeat, deselect, repeat. So it's not that big of a deal, right? So what's the problem? Well, this is a very simple example. Imagine I have a pattern that is much larger. All of a sudden, this manual process becomes very tedious very quickly. And again, because it's a perfect example, it's not very representative. So what I actually have over here is something that looks a little bit closer to this. So I have this orientation, and let's just pretend that these are hexagons. So deselecting the right thing can sometimes get a little bit confusing here. And again, let's pretend that this is a very large pattern, so we would have to maybe isolate it. Do something like this, and again I'm already struggling trying to figure out what I'm selecting. All right, not too bad. And let's make sure we're using individual origins so that when we scale, yeah, the problem is the Falloff in Blender just doesn't usually work the way you want it to. But let me show you how easy it is to do that in Modo. So first off, I'm going to select my n-gons. That's another thing I like about Modo, how easy it is to use statistics to select anything. So you can select by material, by edge count, whatever you want. And I'm going to select a linear falloff here, and then I'm just going to select my scale tool, and I'm going to move my falloff over here. So this is the main thing. We can visually position our falloffs in 3D space exactly where we want them to. So if I just scale this, you can see we're getting sort of that effect. I need to reverse that fall off. Let's just collapse all of this. And there you have it. So it's super straightforward, and I can still adjust this if I want while the tool is active. So this is much more straightforward and much more intuitive than what we would have to do in Blender. Here's a more practical example. Let's say we want to reshape the selection to be tapered like this. A bit straighter, of course. Why? I don't know. Come up with a reason. So the way I would do this is probably maybe just selecting this edge and then just trying to align these edges, either by creating a custom edge or a custom, what is it called, a transform orientation. So you can just do that and then try to scale it towards X and something along those lines. But I'm just going to use a script because it's easier. So I would do that. Do the same thing with the other side. And in the center, I would just delete in grid fill, right? So that's how I would approach it. But I did use a script or two for that. If you don't have those scripts, what would you do? Let's say you might use a lattice as well. You might try to use the falloff again. I already know that's not going to work. There might be some other technique that I'm not remembering right now. But how intuitive is this in Modo? Here we just create our selection. We enable our falloff, and I don't need symmetry in my falloff anymore. And now when I enable my scale tool, you can see it's perfectly sized. So I can just do this. If that's the wrong way, I can just reverse it. And I can even move this over here. And it seems like it's broken, but it's actually functioning correctly. Remember that I scaled it like this. So if I scaled it like this, that's what would give me the correct fall off. So I probably would be better off just undoing before I repositioned it. But the point is I can reposition it. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but falloffs in Modo don't just apply to your basic transformations. They work on any tool, the bevel, extruder, anything that creates geometry and manipulates it. Don't get me wrong, I think it is a terrible idea to try to switch to Modo, especially right now. But I am saying that they did come up with some interesting ideas on how to do things that I think are worthwhile looking into.